The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving Portland wrapped in a thin mist that clung to the streets like memory. Julia Dawson stood by the kitchen window of her small apartment, watching droplets slide down the glass. At 34, she had learned to make peace with silence. It wasn't always this way. Once, she believed life would unfold like the stories she grew up reading. A warm home, a husband who adored her, a family built on trust. That dream began when she was barely more than a girl. At 18, Julia had fallen in love with Mark Dawson, a man a few years older who promised the world and handed her fragments. They married quickly with more hope than sense, and she believed they would figure things out together. But life had other plans. Those first months were a blur of second-hand furniture and shared dreams whispered into the dark. Then came the pregnancy, unexpected but welcomed, and with it a shift in everything. Mark announced he needed to leave town for work. "It's the only way to give our son a future," he'd said, kissing her forehead before disappearing for weeks. He wrote occasionally, claimed he was saving money, but no money ever came. Instead, there were excuses. A stolen wallet, a crooked boss, bad luck. Each time, Julia wanted to believe him. Each time, she swallowed the rising knot of fear that maybe she had married a man who wasn't coming back, at least not the way she hoped. When he did return, it wasn't with the warmth of a husband who missed his family. He was angry, suspicious, quick to accuse her of things she hadn't done. He blamed her for tying him down, for ruining his chances at a better life, for trapping him with a child. And when words stopped being enough, his hands spoke instead. The first slap shocked her into silence. The second taught her that silence wouldn't save her. By the time he raised his hand again, Julia had already decided she was leaving. One cold October night, after another screaming match ended with bruises blooming on her arms, Julia wrapped her sleeping son Ethan in a blanket, slipped on the first pair of shoes she could find, and stepped into the darkness. She didn't pack clothes or toys. There was no plan, no destination, just a desperate need to get away before he broke more than her body. She spent that night on a friend's couch, her heart pounding at every sound in the hallway, afraid Mark might come looking. He didn't. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he thought she'd crawl back like before. She never did. Julia's parents took her and Ethan in without questions. Her father simply hugged her and said, "You should have left sooner." Her mother cooked soup and tucked Ethan into bed while Julia slept for the first time in months without fear. Yet safety didn't mean ease. There were 3 adults and a toddler squeezed into a 2-bedroom house. Bills piled up. Julia, with no degree and little work experience, took whatever job she could, cashier shifts, cleaning offices, stocking shelves at night. There were nights when dinner was bread and soup, when she cut back on meals so Ethan could have more. But even in the exhaustion, there was a quiet strength growing inside her. She spent long hours after Ethan fell asleep staring at the ceiling, thinking about what kind of life she wanted for them. She no longer dreamed of fairy tales. She dreamed of stability, of a small apartment they could call their own, of shoes Ethan wouldn't outgrow before she could afford another pair, of mornings that didn't begin with fear. Slowly, painfully, she began to build that life. It started with a part-time job at a small florist shop. Flowers had always calmed her, their quiet resilience mirroring her own. Her boss noticed her dedication and soon offered her full-time hours. The bruises faded, but the memory of them remained, shaping her resolve. Julia wasn't naive anymore. She understood now that love wasn't enough to save a marriage and that promises without action were just empty air. Most of all, she knew that no one was coming to rescue her. She would have to rescue herself. Standing at the kitchen window all those years later, watching the mist drift across the city she now called home, Julia Dawson felt something stir inside her that had been gone for a long time. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was the beginning of it, the fragile, stubborn spark of a life rebuilt from nothing. By the time Ethan turned 4, the chaos of Julia's early 20s had settled into something steadier, if not exactly easy. Life was still a patchwork of double shifts and second-hand furniture, but their little apartment above the florist shop smelled like lavender and sunlight, and laughter returned to their evenings. It was during this quiet, cautious chapter that Brian Cole entered her life. He wasn't the whirlwind Mark had been. There were no grand promises or passionate declarations. Brian was gentle, soft-spoken, and seemed to understand the bruises life had left on her heart. He listened more than he spoke, brought Ethan little toy cars on weekends, and told Julia that she deserved a man who would never raise his voice at her. After everything she had endured, his calm felt like a refuge. They met at a neighborhood bookstore on a rainy afternoon. Julia was helping Ethan pick out picture books when Brian struck up a conversation about gardening. He was a freelance graphic designer, he explained, someone who valued a slower pace. At first, that sounded like a dream. Julia was exhausted from running at full speed just to keep life afloat. Brian's pace was steady, comforting, like a pause she didn't know she needed. Their coffee dates turned into dinners into weekends spent together. Within a year, Brian moved into her apartment, and for a while, Julia believed this might finally be the love story she'd been waiting for. But as months blurred into seasons, the comforting slowness began to reveal its shadow. Brian didn't just prefer a slower pace, he seemed allergic to ambition. He took on small projects here and there, but never stuck with anything long enough to bring in steady income. When the rent was due or Ethan needed new shoes, Julia's paycheck was the one that covered it. She told herself it was temporary, that he was still finding his footing. She had, after all, once believed in second chances. Still, the imbalance grew harder to ignore. Julia would return from 12-hour shifts at the shop to find Brian scrolling on his laptop, promising that work was just around the corner. When she gently asked about applying for more clients or looking for part-time work, he would bristle. "You think I'm lazy?" he'd snap, wounded. "I'm trying. I just don't have the same luck you do." The arguments never turned cruel, but they chipped away at something fragile between them, the belief that they were a team. After a year of living together, Julia finally spoke the words she'd been rehearsing in her head for weeks. One evening after dinner, with Ethan asleep in his room, she sat across from Brian and told him they needed to talk about money, about responsibility. She told him she didn't expect wealth, just effort, a sign that he was building a life with her instead of leaning on the one she was already building alone. Brian's face changed as she spoke, shifting from surprise to offense. He accused her of sounding like his ex, of turning everything into a transaction. He said he thought she loved him for who he was, not for what he earned. That night, he packed a small bag and told her he needed space to think. Julia didn't stop him. She watched him close the door softly behind him, the sound more final than any slammed door could have been. Days turned into weeks, and Brian's messages grew fewer until they stopped altogether. Just like that, he was gone. No screaming, no betrayal, just a quiet retreat from a life that had become too heavy for him to carry. The emptiness that followed wasn't as sharp as it had been with Mark. There were no bruises, no panic-filled nights. This time, the pain was duller, more like a reminder than a wound. Julia missed the companionship, the easy laughter, the small gestures, but she didn't miss rearranging her dreams to accommodate someone else's inertia. She had done enough of that. In the months that followed, Julia threw herself into work and motherhood. The florist shop expanded. She learned to negotiate with suppliers, to design arrangements that customers raved about. Ethan started kindergarten, and their evenings were filled with stories and art projects instead of tense conversations about overdue bills. For the first time in years, Julia felt something close to peace. She began to understand that loneliness was not the same as emptiness, that her worth wasn't measured by whether a man chose to stay. She could stand on her own, and she would. The spring Julia turned 26. The shop that had once been a cramped corner inside someone else's business finally became her own. With a modest loan from her parents and years of saved tips, She rented a small storefront on the east side of Portland and painted its weathered walls a soft sage green. Bloom and Vine. The sign read, her dream in carved wood and fresh paint. At first, she worried no one would come. But word spread quickly about the florist, who remembered customers' anniversaries by heart and crafted bouquets that felt like stories. Within a year, she was supplying arrangements for weddings, hotels, and community events. Business thrived, and so did Julia. The girl who once hid bruises beneath long sleeves was now a business owner, a provider, a mother building something lasting from the rubble of her past. It was during this period of quiet growth that Scott Harper walked into her life. He first appeared at the shop one rainy afternoon, tall and well-dressed, looking for flowers for his sister's engagement party. He lingered after making his purchase, asking questions about the business, about Ethan, about Julia herself. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, the kind of man who seemed to light up a room just by entering it. He remembered small details, how she took her coffee, the book she was reading, and his attention felt like sunlight after a long winter. Julia, cautious after everything she had endured, tried to keep her distance. But Scott was patient, persistent, and slowly, carefully, he found his way into her heart. Their relationship unfolded quickly once she allowed it. Scott was affectionate, thoughtful, and seemingly invested, not just in her, but in Ethan too. He helped fix things around the shop, cooked dinner on nights she worked late, and told her she deserved to be cherished. For the first time, Julia let herself imagine a future with someone again, a partner to share the weight she had carried alone for so long. After 8 months of dating, Scott suggested they move in together. It felt like the natural next step. But soon after he unpacked his boxes and hung his clothes in her closet, subtle shifts began to appear. At first, they were small, harmless comments about how Ethan needed more discipline, or how Julia worked too much. Then the tone hardened. He started setting rules for the boy. No playing outside without asking him first, no cartoons before finishing homework, no visiting friends on weekdays. Ethan, confused and withdrawn, began spending more time in his room. When Julia protested, Scott brushed it off. "I'm just trying to help," he'd say, his voice smooth but final. "He needs a man's influence." The rules grew stricter, the criticism sharper. Scott questioned Julia's decisions constantly, from the way she ran her shop to the meals she cooked. "You're too soft," he'd mutter when she comforted Ethan after a scraped knee. "You're too emotional." One evening, after she challenged him about a particularly harsh punishment he'd given Ethan for spilling juice, Scott turned to her and said, almost casually, "You're just a woman, Julia. You should know your place." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and choking. That night, Julia lay awake long after Scott had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling with a hollow ache in her chest. It was as if every bruise, every insult from her past had come rushing back in his voice. She had promised herself she would never live in fear again. Not for herself, and certainly not for her son. By morning, the decision was made. When Scott came home from work that evening, his key no longer fit the lock. His clothes were packed in boxes by the door. Julia didn't yell or cry. She simply told him that this was over, that she would not raise Ethan in a home ruled by fear or control. Scott laughed bitterly, accused her of being ungrateful, of throwing away a good man. But Julia didn't waver. She closed the door behind him and leaned against it, trembling, her heart breaking even as relief washed through her. It hurt, God, it hurt, to watch another relationship collapse. But as Ethan slipped his small hand into hers and whispered, "Are we okay now, Mom?" Julia realized she had gained something far more precious than what she'd lost. She had reclaimed her home, and more importantly, she had shown her son, and herself, that love built on control wasn't love at all. It was a golden afternoon in late September, the kind Portland offered as summer surrendered to fall. The air was crisp, the sidewalks littered with the first scattered leaves. Julia had stayed late at the shop that day, finishing a large order for a downtown hotel, while her mother offered to take Ethan for a walk in the park. It was their routine. Ethan loved feeding the ducks by the pond, and her mother cherished those small, ordinary moments with her grandson. Julia kissed them both goodbye at the door, never imagining that kiss would be the last one she'd give her mother. She was cleaning up stray stems and wiping down the counter when the phone rang. At first, she ignored it, humming softly as she worked. But it rang again, insistent this time. When she answered, a stranger's trembling voice spilled words that didn't seem to belong together. "Accident, ambulance. Your son, please come quickly." The world tilted on its axis. Julia didn't remember locking the shop, didn't remember the drive, only the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears and the taste of copper in her mouth as she whispered Ethan's name over and over like a prayer. When she arrived at the intersection near the park, flashing lights painted the pavement red and blue. A small crowd had gathered, faces pale and hushed. Julia pushed through them, her legs barely obeying her, until she saw the crumpled stroller, the twisted bicycle frame, and then a blanket on the ground. Under it lay her mother, still and lifeless. A paramedic was kneeling beside Ethan, who wasn't moving. His face was ghostly pale, his small body limp as they placed him on a stretcher. Julia screamed his name, but he didn't respond. Someone grabbed her arm, a police officer, telling her she couldn't go closer, that they were trying to save him. She barely heard the words. All she could see was her boy's unmoving hand and the blood matting his hair. Then she saw the man in handcuffs, leaning against a patrol car, his face flushed and glassy-eyed. It took a moment for her brain to catch up with what her eyes already knew. Michael, her ex-husband, Ethan's father. He was shouting something slurred and incoherent, insisting it wasn't his fault, that they came out of nowhere. The officer beside him shook his head and said his blood alcohol level was over the legal limit, twice over. Julia's knees buckled. The man who had abandoned them years ago had now destroyed everything that remained. Her father arrived minutes later and collapsed to his knees beside her mother's body. The shock was too much. As Julia tried to steady him, his breathing grew ragged, his face ashen. Paramedics rushed to his side, calling out numbers and orders as they loaded him into another ambulance. Julia stood frozen between the two vehicles, one carrying the man who had broken her heart years ago, one carrying the man who had raised her, and one carrying the boy who was her whole world. At the hospital, time ceased to exist. Hours stretched and collapsed as doctors moved in and out of the operating room. Julia sat in the hallway outside surgery, still in her work clothes, hands stained with soil from the shop. She stared at the floor, unable to pray, unable to breathe. Her mother was gone. Her father was in critical care. And Ethan, her beautiful, bright Ethan, was somewhere behind those double doors, fighting for his life. A surgeon finally emerged, his expression grave. Ethan had survived the operation, but the damage was severe. A traumatic brain injury, spinal complications, a future no one could predict. "He may never walk again," the doctor said gently. Julia nodded, though the words barely penetrated the fog that surrounded her. When they finally let her into his room, she almost didn't recognize him. Tubes snaked from his small body, machines beeped steadily, and a bandage wrapped around his head. She sank into the chair beside his bed and took his hand, whispering stories about the ducks at the pond, about the flowers waiting for him back home, about how proud she was of him. Her tears soaked the blanket, but she didn't care. Somewhere beneath the crushing weight of grief, a flicker of resolve sparked. Julia had no idea how she would do it, no roadmap, no plan. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would fight for her son with every breath she had. Whatever it took, doctors, specialists, therapy, miracles, she would find a way. Ethan had always been her reason to keep going. Now he was her reason to never stop. The weeks that followed blurred into one another, a haze of antiseptic air, whispered prayers, and sleepless nights. Ethan remained in the pediatric rehabilitation unit, his small frame dwarfed by the machinery surrounding him. There were moments when his fingers twitched, when his eyelids fluttered as if he were trying to find his way back. But the doctor's words echoed in Julia's mind every time she dared to hope he may never walk again. Physical therapy sessions were grueling and yielded little progress. Each time Ethan tried to move his legs and failed, a piece of Julia's heart seemed to splinter. She spent hours talking to specialists, combing through research, and reading late into the night. Most offered little more than polite sympathy and tempered expectations. Focus on adapting your home, one advised gently. Make peace with the possibility that this is permanent. Julia nodded through the conversations, but inside she raged against them. Permanent was not an option, not for her boy. One afternoon, as she sat by Ethan's bed watching him sleep, she overheard two neurosurgeons talking outside the door. They spoke in hushed tones about Dr. Richard Hayes, a pioneer in neurorehabilitation who had achieved remarkable results with spinal trauma patients. He had retired years ago and disappeared from the public eye, retreating to a remote cabin in the Cascade Mountains. Most believed he no longer saw patients, but some whispered that he occasionally took on special cases. The name burned into Julia's thoughts. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, she scoured every article, interview, and medical journal she could find on Richard Hayes. His work was legendary, groundbreaking techniques that had given children like Ethan a second chance at walking. And then, abruptly, he had vanished from the field. No practice, no forwarding address, only a vague mention of a cabin in the Cascades. The next morning, Julia made her decision. She withdrew what little savings she had, packed a bag with essentials, and arranged for Ethan's physical therapy to continue as an outpatient until they returned. Friends and hospital staff tried to dissuade her. The journey was long, the location uncertain, the odds slim. But Julia's resolve was unshakable. She had spent too many nights staring at the ceiling, imagining her son trapped in a chair for the rest of his life. If there was even a fragment of hope in those mountains, she would find it. The trip was harder than she had imagined. The drive alone took nearly a day, winding deeper into forested roads where cell service vanished and gas stations became rare. She and Ethan stayed overnight in a small roadside inn before continuing at dawn. As the sun climbed over the pines, Julia followed directions scribbled from an old newspaper article, praying she hadn't made a terrible mistake. Ethan sat quietly in the back seat, his head resting against the window, eyes full of a patience that broke her heart. By late afternoon, they reached a clearing where a modest cabin stood, tucked between towering cedars. Julia's pulse quickened as she stepped out of the car and knocked on the weathered door. A tall man with graying hair and kind eyes answered. "I'm sorry," he said gently before she could speak. "My father passed away 2 years ago." The words hit her like a physical blow. All the miles, all the hope she'd clung to, gone in an instant. She felt her knees weaken as she tried to explain, her voice trembling as she spoke of Ethan, the accident, the desperate search for a miracle. The man listened silently, his gaze drifting toward the car where Ethan sat. After a long pause, he introduced himself, Dr. Lucas Hayes, Richard's son. He had followed in his father's footsteps, specializing in pediatric neurorehabilitation. "I'm not my father," he said softly, "but I've spent my life trying to learn from him. And if you're willing, I'd like to see if I can help your boy." Julia's breath caught. She hadn't expected kindness here, not after so many closed doors. She glanced back at Ethan, then at Lucas, and for the first time since that terrible day at the park, something other than fear bloomed in her chest. It was small and fragile, but it was real. It was hope. The cabin in the Cascades became their new world, a place where time slowed to the rhythm of the forest and healing was measured, not in days, but in the smallest movements. Dr. Lucas Hayes wasted no time after agreeing to help Ethan. He studied the boy's medical records, adjusted his brace, and designed a therapy plan unlike anything Julia had seen before. A blend of conventional rehabilitation and innovative techniques his father had pioneered. Mornings began with gentle exercises to retrain Ethan's muscles, followed by sensory stimulation drills meant to rebuild the connection between his body and brain. Afternoons were devoted to hydrotherapy in a heated pool behind the cabin, where the resistance of water allowed Ethan to move without pain. Progress was slow, agonizingly so. The first week brought no visible change. Ethan often cried from frustration, and Julia cried quietly in the kitchen when he couldn't see. But Lucas was unwavering. "Healing isn't linear," he told them. "It's a climb, not a sprint." He spoke to Ethan like an equal, never pitying him, never lowering expectations. And Ethan responded to that. Bit by bit, he pushed through the frustration. By the second month, his toes twitched when Lucas touched them. By the third, he could move one leg a few inches. The first time he stood with the help of parallel bars. Julia covered her mouth to muffle the sob that escaped her. Life in the mountains settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Julia cooked meals while Lucas and Ethan worked on exercises. In the evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the tree line. Ethan curled up with a book while the adults talked long after the stars appeared. At first, the conversations were about therapy schedules and recovery milestones. Then, slowly, they shifted to music, to childhood memories, to wounds they had both carried for years. One night, as a fire crackled in the hearth and rain tapped gently on the roof, Lucas spoke about the reason he had left his city life behind. He had once been engaged to a woman named Jadwiga, brilliant, ambitious, someone he believed he would spend his life with. But betrayal had crept in quietly. She had fallen in love with another man, and Lucas discovered the affair only weeks before their wedding. "I thought I knew who I was," he admitted, staring into the flames. Then one lie unraveled everything. "I couldn't practice medicine in the same halls where I'd once planned a future with her, so I walked away." Julia listened in silence, understanding more than she let on. She told him about Mark, the violence, the fear, the night she ran barefoot into the dark. She spoke of the humiliation of begging landlords for extensions, of working 3 jobs, and still coming up short, of trying to explain to a little boy why his father didn't come home. Lucas didn't interrupt. He just reached across the table and took her hand, not as a gesture of comfort, but of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of shared scars. What began as companionship deepened into something neither had expected. They moved around each other with a quiet familiarity, finishing each other's sentences, reading thoughts in a glance. One morning, Julia found herself laughing, truly laughing, as Lucas and Ethan argued over how many pancakes were too many. It was a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. And one evening, as the sun bled gold across the mountains, Lucas kissed her, gentle, hesitant, like a man relearning trust. By the 6th month, Ethan took his first steps with a pair of crutches. Julia wept openly, clutching him to her chest as Lucas looked on, his own eyes shining. The impossible had become possible. And yet, even as joy filled the cabin, Julia knew it was time. Ethan needed school, therapy, friends, a world bigger than the forest. Their life in the mountains had been a sanctuary, but it could not be forever. On their last night there, Julia stood with Lucas under a sky heavy with stars. "I have to take him back," she whispered. "He needs more than I can give him here." Lucas nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. "I know, but I'll be here, however long it takes." When they left the next morning, Ethan waving through the car window, the road ahead felt uncertain but alive with possibility. Julia glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin fading into the trees, and then at her son beside her, asleep and dreaming. Somewhere between heartbreak and hope, she had found something she never thought she'd have again. Love, fragile but real. And now, she carried it with her back into the world. Returning to Portland after months in the Cascades felt like stepping into a world that had been paused and was now waiting to resume. The city streets hummed with life. The shop smelled of fresh blooms again, and for the first time since the accident, Julia felt a quiet sense of stability. Ethan continued his therapy at a specialized rehabilitation center, and the progress he made astonished even the doctors. He learned to balance on his crutches, then to take cautious steps without them. Each milestone was celebrated with ice cream and laughter, each small victory a reminder of how far they had come. Life found a rhythm once more. Julia threw herself into work, expanding Bloom and Vine with new clients and floral workshops. Her evenings were filled with homework sessions and bedtime stories. The apartment was filled with warmth and noise, the kind of noise she used to dream about on lonely nights. Yet, even in the fullness of this new life, there were moments when her thoughts drifted back to the cabin, to quiet evenings beneath a canopy of stars, and to Lucas. They exchanged letters and calls, and though he never pressured her, Julia sensed that his feelings hadn't faded. Truthfully, neither had hers. One mild spring afternoon, Julia took Ethan to their favorite park. He walked beside her, still cautious but determined, his crutches swinging lightly with each step. They were sharing a bag of roasted almonds and talking about the ducks when a voice she hadn't heard in years sliced through the calm. "Julia!" She turned and felt her stomach tighten. Scott Harper was standing a few feet away, his smile thin and bitter. "You've been ignoring my calls," he said, stepping closer. Julia's pulse quickened. She hadn't spoken to him since the day she changed the locks. "There's nothing to say," she replied evenly, pulling Ethan closer. Scott's face darkened. "You think you're too good for me now. You think you can just erase me." He grabbed her wrist before she could step back. The suddenness of it froze her, the pressure of his fingers, the familiar surge of fear she thought she'd buried. "Let me go," she said firmly, but he tightened his grip. Ethan shouted for him to stop, but Scott's anger only flared. "You owe me a chance," he hissed. Before Julia could react, another voice, deeper, steadier, cut through the tension. "She doesn't owe you anything." Scott turned, and his expression shifted from fury to shock. Lucas was striding across the grass, his eyes locked on Scott with a calm that was more dangerous than shouting. "Step away," Lucas warned. Scott scoffed, muttering something about meddling doctors, but the look in Lucas's eyes was enough to make him retreat a few steps. "If you ever touch her again," Lucas said quietly, "you'll regret it." Scott's bravado crumbled. Muttering under his breath, he turned and stalked away, disappearing into the thinning afternoon crowd. Julia stood frozen, her heart still racing, Ethan clinging to her side. Lucas approached slowly, concern softening his features. "Are you okay?" he asked, and she nodded, though her hands were trembling. How are you here?" she whispered. "I told you I'd wait," he said with a small smile. But waiting didn't mean staying away. They walked together through the park until Ethan grew tired and needed to rest. They sat on a bench beneath an old maple tree, and Lucas took Julia's hand. "I came back because I realized something," he said. "I don't want to build a life without you. Not in those mountains, not anywhere." Her breath caught as he dropped to one knee on the grass. "Julia Dawson," he said, his voice steady, "will you marry me?" For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's face lit up with joy. "Say yes, Mom," he urged, his eyes shining. And she did. The word felt light and certain on her tongue, yes. Their wedding, held a few months later in a small garden behind the shop, was simple and perfect. Ethan walked beside Julia down the aisle, his steps sure and proud. Friends and family gathered beneath strings of fairy lights as vows were exchanged, tears were shed, and laughter rippled through the air. When Lucas slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, Julia knew she was no longer just surviving. She was living. And for the first time in a long time, their family was whole. For a while, it felt like everything Julia had ever dreamed of was finally within reach. Marriage brought with it a deep, steady happiness she had once believed was impossible. Bloom and Vine continued to thrive. Ethan's recovery exceeded every prognosis, and evenings were spent with the three of them cooking dinner together or reading by the fire. Lucas, too, seemed content, more grounded than he had been in years. Yet beneath that happiness, life was shifting in ways Julia couldn't see. It started with a phone call one gray November morning. Julia was arranging winter bouquets in the shop when Lucas walked in, his expression unreadable. "That was St. Mary's Medical Center," he said, naming one of Portland's most prestigious hospitals. "They want me to come back to head the neurology department." The news should have filled her with pride, and part of her was proud. Lucas had once been considered one of the brightest minds in his field before leaving it all behind. This was recognition of that brilliance, but another part of her felt uneasy. The hospital was in the same city where he and Jadwiga had lived, where everything between them had unraveled. Lucas brushed off her concerns. "That's the past," he said, kissing her forehead. "This is about the future, our future." And for a while it seemed like he was right. He threw himself into his new role with energy she hadn't seen in years. He came home tired but fulfilled, talking about new research projects and colleagues who respected his work. Julia listened and smiled, even as late nights at the hospital grew more frequent, even as his text messages became shorter and his kisses distracted. Then one evening, 3 months into his new position, Lucas came home later than usual. Julia was in the kitchen, helping Ethan with a school project, when she heard the door close softly. Something in the silence that followed made her turn. Lucas was standing there, still in his hospital coat, but he didn't step forward. He looked haunted. "We need to talk," he said quietly. The words that followed shattered her world. He told her that Jadwiga was back, that she had taken a position at the same hospital. They had seen each other by chance, and all the feelings he thought had died resurfaced. He confessed he had met her several times in recent weeks, and then, with his voice barely above a whisper, he admitted the truth. He had slept with her. Julia felt the room spin. The walls seemed to close in, the hum of the refrigerator too loud, Ethan's crayons too bright. "You're telling me this like it's some noble confession," she said, her voice trembling. "Like I should admire your honesty." Lucas's face crumpled. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said. "I thought I was over her, but I'm not. I still love her." The words cut deeper than any betrayal before. Not just the act, but the admission that his heart had never fully been hers. The next morning, Lucas packed a suitcase. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He kissed Ethan's forehead, murmured something Julia didn't catch, and walked out of the apartment without looking back. The door closed with a quiet click, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the world itself had stopped. Julia collapsed. She spent the next 2 days in bed, unable to eat, unable to speak. The life she had built, the fragile trust, the second chance, lay in ruins. Ethan crept into the room at night, curling against her side and whispering, "It's okay, Mom. We still have each other." His small hand in hers was the only thing that kept her from disappearing entirely. On the 3rd day, Claudia arrived without warning. She had been Julia's friend since college, the one who had helped her after Mark, who had watched Ethan when Julia couldn't afford childcare. She didn't try to fix anything. She simply opened the curtains, brewed coffee, and sat beside Julia in silence. When Julia finally spoke, a hoarse whisper of, "I don't know how to do this again," Claudia squeezed her hand. "You've done harder things," she said, "and you're not doing this alone." The words didn't erase the pain, but they planted a seed. Julia dragged herself out of bed that evening, showered, and ate her first meal since Lucas left. She wasn't okay, not even close, but she was still standing. And somewhere deep inside, buried beneath the devastation, a small, stubborn voice reminded her that she had survived heartbreak before. She could do it again. Life with Jadwiga didn't unfold the way Lucas had imagined. For a few weeks, The rekindled romance felt intoxicating. Familiar laughter, shared memories, the illusion that they could rewrite the past. But reality crept in quickly. Old arguments resurfaced. Trust never truly returned, and the cracks that had once broken them apart widened once more. Jadwiga was restless, ambitious, and never fully present. She spent long nights working late, left town for conferences without explanation, and avoided questions with practiced charm. 6 months after Lucas had walked out on Julia, he came home early from a hospital fundraiser and found Jadwiga in his apartment with another man. She didn't cry or beg for forgiveness. She simply shrugged and said, "It was never meant to be forever." The betrayal gutted him. The life he had thrown everything away for, his marriage, Ethan's trust, Julia's love, evaporated in a single evening. Jadwiga moved out within days, and Lucas was left alone in a sterile apartment filled with ghosts of choices he couldn't undo. He buried himself in work, volunteering for extra shifts and research projects, but nothing filled the hollow ache in his chest. Every hospital corridor reminded him of Julia's laughter. Every patient's small victory echoed Ethan's determination. Regret became his constant companion, a weight he carried everywhere. While Lucas's world unraveled, Julia was rebuilding hers piece by piece. In the months after the betrayal, she poured all her energy into Ethan and Bloom and Vine. The shop flourished under her care, expanding into 2 new locations and becoming a fixture in Portland's event scene. She started teaching floral design workshops and even hired women who, like her, were trying to rebuild their lives after hardship. The work gave her purpose and structure, a reason to get out of bed on the days grief threatened to pull her back under. Ethan continued to make remarkable progress. He still walked with a slight limp, but his confidence soared. He joined a local robotics club, made friends, and often came home bursting with stories about projects they were building. Watching him thrive reminded Julia of the strength they had both earned, not given, but fought for inch by inch. In the midst of this new chapter, a letter arrived from the State Corrections Department. Michael Dawson, the man who had destroyed so much with one reckless choice, had died in prison. The official cause was heart failure, but the words felt strangely hollow on the page. Julia sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading it, the memories flooding back, the flashing lights, the blood on Ethan's hair, her father collapsing beside her mother's body. At his sentencing, she had told Michael through gritted teeth that she hoped he would live long enough to feel the weight of what he'd done. "You took everything from me," she had said, "and I hope the silence of that cell echoes louder every day." Now that chapter was over. She didn't feel joy, nor the righteous satisfaction she had once imagined. Just a deep, quiet release, as if a door that had been locked for years had finally creaked open. Michael's death couldn't undo the pain he'd caused, but it ended the story on her terms, not his. In time, Julia learned to forgive. Not Michael, not Lucas, but herself. She forgave the younger version of her who had stayed too long with a violent man, the woman who had believed she needed someone else to make her whole, the mother who had spent nights blaming herself for Ethan's suffering. Forgiveness didn't come all at once. It arrived slowly in small moments. Laughing with Ethan over burnt pancakes, signing the lease for her 3rd shop, realizing she could go days without thinking of Lucas. Lucas reached out a few times, emails she never answered, letters she never opened. She didn't hate him anymore, but she also didn't need him. The life she was building no longer had a place for someone who had walked away. On a quiet Sunday morning, Julia and Ethan visited her mother's grave. Ethan placed a bouquet of white lilies on the grass, his idea, and they stood together in silence. Julia felt the sun on her face and the steady beat of her son's heart beside her. The past had left its scars, but it had also forged something unbreakable. She was no longer a woman defined by betrayal and loss. She was Julia Dawson, mother, survivor, builder of a life that was entirely her own. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. 3 years passed, and time, that once merciless tide that had swept Julia from one heartbreak to another, finally became an ally. The wounds had long since scabbed over, leaving behind faint scars that no longer throbbed when touched. Life settled into a rhythm, both ordinary and extraordinary. The shop she had started with nothing but borrowed money and trembling hands had grown into a thriving business with 3 locations across Portland. Julia became known as the florist who remembered every story behind every bouquet. A businesswoman respected not just for her talent, but for her resilience. At home, Ethan had blossomed into a vibrant, determined young boy. His limp was barely noticeable now, a slight sway that only those who knew his story would recognize. He ran with his friends at the park, climbed trees, and raced his robotics projects across the living room floor. Every laugh, every unsteady step that became a confident stride was a victory Julia never stopped celebrating. Their small apartment was filled with warmth, the smell of fresh bread on Sundays, the clutter of school projects on the kitchen table, the soft hum of music drifting through the evenings. Lucas was little more than a distant memory now, a ghost who occasionally surfaced in whispers from mutual acquaintances. After Jadwiga left him, he had thrown himself deeper into his work, earning accolades and publishing research. But none of it filled the void he had carved in his own life. He lived alone in a sleek apartment overlooking the city, surrounded by the trappings of success, but haunted by the family he had let slip through his fingers. People said he often paused in front of Bloom and Vine's flagship shop on his walks home from the hospital, watching through the window as Julia arranged flowers or helped Ethan with his homework. But he never went inside. He knew some distances could not be crossed twice. Julia sometimes thought about him, not with anger anymore, not even with sadness, but with a quiet acknowledgement of what had been and what could never be again. Love, she had learned, was not just about how someone made you feel. It was about how they showed up when everything was on the line. And Lucas, for all his brilliance and tenderness, had chosen to leave. That choice defined him more than any apology could erase. Her life was full now, richer and more complete than she ever thought possible in the dark days after the accident. She hosted community workshops in her shop, teaching others how to find beauty in simple things. She spoke at women's shelters about resilience, about how survival wasn't just about enduring, but about rebuilding, piece by piece, until the life you created was stronger than the one that broke. And on quiet evenings, when the city lights flickered against the windows and Ethan's laughter echoed down the hallway, Julia would curl up on the couch with a cup of tea and marvel at how far they had come. There were no fairy tales here, no sweeping romantic reunions or dramatic declarations. Just a woman and her son, standing tall in a life they had built from ashes. A woman who had been beaten, betrayed, abandoned, and who had still risen, stronger than before. Sometimes betrayal takes everything. The people you love, the future you imagined, the version of yourself you once believed in. But it cannot destroy the will to rise again. Julia Dawson had learned that truth the hardest way possible. And as she locked up her shop one crisp autumn night, Ethan running ahead of her on legs once deemed useless, she smiled. Not because the past no longer mattered, but because it no longer defined her. The road behind her was littered with heartbreak. The road ahead was hers alone, wide open, waiting and free